Hi, Musa. How are you doing?
I'm all right, Jonathan. How are you?
I'm all right. I've had a very nice weekend. I spent it with my sister, and in the course of that, a lot of childhood memories came up, and a lot of sort of processing them. A lot of family dynamics came up. It was very interesting, and see someone I can
Oh,
talk to about
really?
those things. So it was very nice. What's happening your end?
Very similar, actually. I went to Germany this weekend, and I have an uncle in Germany who is the sole surviving. So he's my grandmother's brother, my mother's mother's brother. So he's the sole surviving blood relation from that side of the family. I mean, we keep up with our kind of extended families, but he's had a very hard life, and yeah, there's a very special story about him. So I try and meet him, try to get the kids to see him, try and keep that link alive. Yeah,
And I mean, I'm intrigued what it's about. But before we do that, why is that important to you?
I suppose that's a really good question. I suppose there's something about legacy, something about who we are, or something about some things that must not be forgotten, that extend beyond our immediate concerns about the moment and the our concerns about making money or the future, or how am I going to pay the mortgage, or these kind of things. There's some core identity that certain aspects of history embed into you.
And you've got your own family involved. You said you took your children with you, and why was that important to you?
My yeah, yeah. I'm surprised we've never actually talked about this. I mean, we've talked about everything else, Jonathan. But so my grandparents, so all four of my grandparents actually, they were hugely affected by the trauma of partition in the subcontinent, in the Indian subcontinent. And my grandmother, she lost all of her family in a big massacre in 1947. Um, it was uh, it was a tragedy that um, stayed with us as a family over several generations and still affects us actually. Um, and it's something that we can't completely forget or let go of as a family. Um,
Are you
and
okay
the
if we talk?
survivors,
Are you okay if
yeah,
we talk about it?
yeah, absolutely, yeah,
Can I therefore ask you a question? Because I know a bit about partition, but I mean
sure, sure,
to be shamefully honest, most of it's come from watching the film Gandhi many
okay.
years ago. How would you describe what happened in partition and the violence that happened in partition?
I think India was under British Empire. India stretched from uh, now what is three countries: Pakistan, Bangladesh, and what we know as India. It had been a collection essentially of princely states before the British kind of took over. The British had taken over through the East India Company, and also a policy of divide and rule. There's lots of debate about empire, whether it's good or a bad thing, what advances it brought to India, how much it took out of India. We won't go into all of that. But there came a point after the Second World War where Britain was in essence indebted to its colonies. There had been a push for maybe 25 years, possibly longer than that, which is detailed in the history great length, about Indian independence. But basically, the British could not sustain their empire anymore. The Americans had probably put some pressure on the British to disband empire. And so, in a very short period of time, the British left all of a sudden um, without working all the finer details out. Now, what had essentially happened was these very different nations, which had been pieced together and were called India, um, were divided of two main faiths. There were others, of course, but the two main faiths were the Hindu majority, which was, I think, 78, probably 80% of the population, and a Muslim minority, which was around 15, 20%, something like that. There were others as well. There were Sikhs and Christians and many other faiths, Buddhists. India has always been a pluralistic land. The Muslims were worried that what they called a Hindu Raj would subsume them all. Muslim landowners were worried, and the Muslim, common people were also worried, and some of that formed a unified political view of a party called the Muslim League, which was the Muslim party, an answer to the main other independence party, which was called Congress. So a decision was made to essentially split the land to partition the land. It didn't make complete geographic sense because the Muslim areas were contiguous along both the western and eastern border of India. It's a massive landscape, of course. Mm-hmm. And so this new country of Pakistan was born at the same time as a freed India was born at the stroke of midnight on August the 14th, 15th in 1947. That was actually what partition was.
And Pakistan itself is in two parts at that point. Is that right?
At that point, it was in two parts. Later, about 25 years later, the eastern Pakistan seceded from Pakistan and became the new country of Bangladesh. India was also involved in that war, but there was also a civil struggle between the two parts of Pakistan. Yeah.
So let's go back to 1948 and this stroke of midnight. The land is redefined.
47, Jonathan. 47.
1947.
Yeah. So, yeah.
And the land is redefined, and people therefore start to move to where they've been allocated to, or are they forced to move? What takes place as populations respond to this, and politicians encourage populations to act in particular ways?
So what happens is basically partition is happening in two very important provinces of India. One is Bengal, which is on the east side, and the other is the Punjab, right? So the Punjab, which is where my side is from. In fact, all of my grandparents are from the eastern Punjab, which remained in India. That my whole family lineage is from the other side of the wrong side of the border, as it were.
So just to get that right, so we're on the west side of India, but you're on the east part of the Punjab on the west side of India. Is that right? In the north.
That's right. Yeah. And Punjab is a very important province because Punjab means 5 rivers. It's extremely well irrigated. Historically, it's been an extremely rich part of the country. It's been the area where the capitals have been, the great cities of Lahore and Multan, and the Golden Temple of Amritsar. So massive cultural importance to Punjab.
And your family who are Muslim are on the Indian side of the new division.
That's right. Yeah, but essentially, the Punjab was a mainly Muslim province, but it wouldn't have ever been correct to say it was a wholly Muslim province. It wasn't. I've spoken to my grandparents about this a great deal. Punjab was a pluralistic society, where many different faiths and peoples lived side by side. There's lots of aspects. Punjab is a very welcoming to foreign cultures and foreign invaders, foreign languages. It's just the nature that Punjab is. I think both sides basically they say they make good soldiers, India and Pakistan, but essentially Punjabis don't like to fight. Other people have ruled over the Punjab, right? And
So you have there's this area where there's been a cultural history of actually less aggression from the people who lived there.
That's
But
right. Yeah.
now someone's drawn a line across it, and your family are on effectively the wrong side of the line from where people think they should be.
Yeah.
They've got to move.
Sure, but it's not organized movement, right? You know, so I suppose so. There's a historian called Stanley Wolpert, an American historian. He's written a book about the episode, which I, to my regret, gave to my grandfather in his last years. The book is called Shameful Flight, right? And the idea, I mean, the history is always contested, but the idea is basically that the British just decided that they couldn't resolve this difficult problem, and they just ran, basically. You know, Lord Mountbatten was the last viceroy. He comes in for particular criticism, but whatever the history is, essentially, all of a sudden, I think in March the decision is taken, perhaps, that the country will be divided. And by August, the British have basically left, right? There's no orderly, and the army is not involved. There's no orderly transition. What happens in the ensuing months is that sort of political parties and factions begin to form. Now, there's debates about how this started and who started it, you know? But the Sikh community, some leaders from the Sikh community are particularly worried about the division of the Punjab because it's a sacred province to them. It's where their holy lands are, where the religion, where the faith has originated from. And from my perspective, because, you know, it was the Sikhs that persecuted us, you know, and so although, of course, Muslims persecuted Hindus on the other side, but from my perspective,
I'm losing the story a bit. I'm losing the story
okay.
because we've got multiple groups going on.
Mm-hmm.
Probably multiple groups within the multiple groups, to be frank about it.
Of course.
The division happens.
Yeah.
And what happens with your family?
Essentially,
what happens with this? First of all, what happens with this movement? People start moving, but it's not an organised movement. The British have upped and left, just like they upped and left Iraq and they upped and left Afghanistan. They occupy a place, they do what they do to it, and then they just walk away from the mess and deal with it bureaucratically.
Okay.
So what happens?
What happens is essentially that religious political factions start forming, start getting organized, start arming, right? Whilst the population is unprepared. And when the partition essentially happens, massacres ensue, right? They happen on both sides of the border. And obviously our family was caught up in persecution by Sikhs. But on the other side, of course, the people fleeing to India were caught up in persecution by Muslims, right? And when we look at the actual history, what we find is these weren't just sporadic incidents of mob violence. They were planned and called for. Politicians had been kind of working to, or politicians, community leaders, whatever you want to call them, had been working towards this. So although the violence appears very sporadic, it's not. It's systematic. It's widespread. It gets very, very quickly out of hand.
And it's happening, as you say, it's happening on both sides. I'll come back to why you think these riots were planned and why the targeting and the massacres were planned, and it is a theme of mass violence. Is that actually there's an awful lot of planning goes into it, and there's actually parallels with ancient stories of people marking their houses so that the god passes by. But this still goes on. If you paid your vaccinations to the mob that's going to run riots, you mark your house and they'll leave it alone. What I want to know is what happened with your family.
Yeah, because none of that has got anything to do with my family. That's just the overview. What happened with my family is that, or my grandmother's family. My grandmother was 17. She had married my grandfather, who was 23. They had moved to a different town, right? In her home village or town, which is called Senor, which is a farming community, there were many Muslims who lived there, right? The whole clan lived there, in a sense, right? Yeah. And as far as I've understood from my grandparents and such, there were up to hundreds of Muslims who were living there. My grandmother's father was told that partition is coming, you need to leave. And he gave a very, this story has been repeated so many times to me. He gave a very stock response, a very Asian kind of response. Nothing's happening to you. Why should you care? He refused to even countenance it. Nothing's going to happen. Some time went by, and the violence, the flames of violence were kind of engulfing the state and the nation. It may even have been up to a couple of months afterwards. They realized they needed to leave. They got together, they left. I can't remember, I've written this down somewhere, but it's too painful for me to read, so I can't remember every detail of the history. They got together, they left, they went to a field. They were set up on by Sikh marauders. So my grandmother and grandfather at this point had already traveled to Pakistan. They were waiting in Lahore across the border. Her sisters, one of whom was 12, I think there was another babe in arms, her younger brothers, her mother, they were all caught up in this massacre. Essentially, what appears to have happened, although I've never been told this in so much detail, the women were probably raped. They were killed. Their bangles were cut off, and the children were taken, including the young marriageable girls. My grandmother's brothers, one of whom I think was around 11, the other was 3. They played dead in the long grass. There may or may not have, I've never got detail on this, been a baby child with them who somehow got finished, But I don't know exactly what the detail was, but there was some aspect in this whole massacre, right? My grandmother's mother, who was called Jannat Bibi, who herself was a very young mother. She would only have been in her late 30s at this time. She was killed. My grandmother's sister, who was 11 or 12, got taken off. What we later found out was that she was taken off and married to a Sikh man who treated her badly. And then after some time, she went to another family and was married to another Sikh man who treated her well. And, what happened after that is that my great uncles, somehow, they managed to cross over to Lahore. So there was a family house in Lahore. This was, this was the Punjab. So, you have extended family. So everybody knew where to go, right? So somehow they got to Lahore after having played dead, crossing the border and these kind of things. One of them, actually my uncle, I believe he was only 3 years old. This is the one that I went to meet in Germany. And this took some time. My grandmother was sitting there waiting every day patiently for her family to turn up. And then my grandfather just used to describe the kind of the distress of essentially a very young girl when she realizes her whole family has been killed. My great-grandfather, so my grandmother's father, he goes into a deep depression. He survives this. I can't remember. I don't think he was there for the massacre. I think he had been away on business, but he'd go to Pakistan. And he's lost his whole family, apart from these 3 children. He falls into a deep depression. And he essentially marries again. And he almost forgets his 3 children who are alive. Actually, he's got 4 children who's alive. He's got another girl who's across the border in India. My grandfather at this time is a young man, 22, 23, and he's trying to support his wife. And he has friends in India. So what happens over the next few years is that many people go back to recover their lost ones. But my great-grandfather is in such a state of depression, he just forgets about it. He doesn't want to go. So my grandfather, who's his son-in-law, is writing letters with his friends trying to work out what the story is, what's happened, where this girl is. But nobody actually goes across the border. Some members of the extended family, some girls from the extended family manage to come across and get brought back. And they tell my grandmother that your sister is still alive. This is what happened to her. But my grandmother being, essentially a young woman, what was she going to do? She's now having to bear the burden alongside my grandfather of these 2 young children who are survivors because their father has basically is not interested in their welfare.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are other aspects. I don't know all the details, but essentially people who went across the border, they had their, they would apply to the government to have their land or their property reinstated. He had been a landowner in Senor, so now he was given land in Sialkot, which would eventually become very important land, right? And so then my grandmother's step family is the main family that he's looking after. And years later, when he dies, the 2 families argue about the land. But essentially what happens is that my grandmother, for the next 57 years, essentially cries every day about the fact that she has a sister who is left at home. My grandfather, who is a very old school civil servant, trained in almost the British system. You can imagine the type of person who, has a typewriter, very finicky, about documentation and, Tipex and all of that, right? Compiles this book of letters, which one day in the 1960s, which comprised the record of what's happened, right? And one day in the 1960s, at some point, my grandmother gets very upset and she burns them all because she just can't live with the shame. But this is something that, my grandmother always carried with her. My mother carried with her a story that I knew growing up.
So but there's a new part to this, which is why you went to Berlin. What's the new part that you weren't aware of before?
Well, I mean, I don't think there's a new part so much now.
But you saw someone you hadn't seen before.
No. I knew my uncle, right? But over the years, I've come to realize my uncle. He's always been quite quiet. He's always been quite shy. He's always been very reticent. He's very much like my grandmother. He's very much, But there is a. And now my grandmother passed away. She passed away in 2018, 19, I think, 18. And over the years, I've just come to value that relationship much more, And also, I'm losing, this is something we grew up with. It was all around us, this kind of trauma, the reminders of these people were living for us. I suppose what happened was in 2004 or 5, for some reason, my mother suddenly started getting this urge to resolve this issue. She'd always had it, but it became very, very strong in her. I remember I was taking her to a hospital somewhere in East London, and there was a Red Cross on the way, right? A Red Cross building. It was raining very badly that day, and the Red Cross building was completely locked. You can imagine a completely grey, bleak London day, right? And we were trying to work out where the entrance to this place was. I think it was a Sunday. And we just ended up walking around completely soaked, trying to, work out where the entrance to this was so that we could issue a kind of report or something. They'd tried to do this before, but had never been successful. Well, for some reason, on that day, I kind of realized that I just had this sense this matter is going to be resolved now. So shortly thereafter, my mother's a psychiatrist as well. She's a consultant psychiatrist. She had a new doctor on the ward who was Indian Punjabi doctor, which is no new thing, right? I mean, both as you know, many doctors are from the
So
Indian subcontinent.
Sure. What happened with the new doctor on the ward?
She told him. She told him that this is what's happened to my story. So that doctor, he's now working as a child psychiatrist in America. He said, "Oh, okay. Well, my father is a community leader in and a very well-noted professor of economics and a big community leader amongst the Hindus. I'm sure he can sort this out." I mean,
And what are you trying to sort out?
Where is this girl? This 12-year-old girl?
After
Where's her sister?
After how many years is this?
So we found her in 2005, and then we went to India.
And so that goes back from 1947 when she was 11, if I got that right.
Yeah, 11 or 12, yeah.
How did they find her?
So I don't remember exactly all the details, but basically, so this junior doctor told his father back home, who took it to, I think, the telephone records or the electoral boards, right? Yeah, to find out, and so my mother asked my grandfather, who had written all these letters and kept all the correspondence, and they had all now been burnt, but he had it sort of seared in his memory that these were the towns, these were the places, this was where there were sightings of her, these kind of things, right, from the extended family. And so he just said, well, these are the names of the town. And from that, they were able to trace who had, where the lady was. Now, they didn't know exactly who she was, but it so turned out that they were able to trace some other ladies who had been in a similar situation. And one of those ladies was now the head lady of I think it's called Panchayat of the Sikh Council, who then said, yes, I know this lady. I know who they're talking about. She's X and Y, Z, such and such a person. Now she's married there. So so then contact was made. Now, my grandmother's sister was extremely hesitant about the contact having been made. She was herself traumatized. And there were other things as well. So the Muslim girls who had become Sikh, basically, and had lived lives as Sikhs, and had children who were now married to other Sikhs, had always been stigmatized. It was known that there were these girls who had no relations of their own, and that they had been Muslims from beforehand, right? And you can imagine in a society where there had been this massive communal violence, there had been a huge mark of stigma. So she almost didn't want to know, but did want to know, But ultimately, yeah, we went to India to meet her, and it was remarkable. I mean, it was not a great Hollywood moment. It was almost, in some senses, anticlimactic. Because of all the emotions that it brought about. But it was some form of closure.
Can I ask you a question about it? Because, I mean, here you are. You're a kid who's brought up in the home counties of England.
Sure.
Some middle-class English life in the home counties. And these are your parents and your grandparents, and primarily it's your grandparents that we're looking. That is that generation more than anything.
Yeah.
And yet it deeply affects you.
Well, there's a couple of things about. I mean, one was that my mother was a working doctor. My father's an engineer. He was running his own business. So my mother's parents came over to England to help with the childcare, and so essentially my mother's parents raised me, so I suppose that's one of the reasons. But the other thing was, I suppose, this was always a very personal, private side to the life I was living, right? I mean, there were almost two Englands for me, right? There was what was happening in the family home, and all the stories and all the baggage that goes with that, all the cultural expectations, the religious expectations, and then there was, what's outside of that. At some points, that was really difficult for me to reconcile, but it wasn't something I was. So, and I've studied this in many of my, in many of the people of that generation. This wasn't something I was ready to give up. I had this clear sense that this was part of me. I still have that sense, and that's why I never left it behind. Not all of the people in my position did that. Some people wanted to block it out. Some people don't want anything to do with it. Even now, I can see that.
And within your family, was this whole thing just part of, let's say, yearly discussion? Was it something wasn't talked about? Was it talked about? How did they deal with it?
You see, the thing is, my grandmother was a very matriarchal figure. She was in a sense the head of not just the family but the extended family. She was very quiet and reserved, but she was a very dignified lady. And every so often, she would just fall into heaps of tears. It wouldn't be very often, but because I knew her so well. So I always knew what was going on. So then she would also say things which were somewhat at odds with. So she didn't speak any English, right? Which is, one of the reasons my Urdu is relatively good, because I had to speak to her in Urdu. She would also say things which, from a Pakistani context, you see, after that whole story, Pakistan developed a national narrative. That national narrative is kept in books which are called Pak Studies books, right? Which gives you the whole history, some of which I've just told you about, and casts certain actors in certain lights. And my grandmother wasn't interested in that narrative. She just wasn't. You know what I mean? She was interested in what partition had done to her and her family, And that's not to say in any sense that she was anti-Pakistani or against the idea of Pakistan, but she would always say, look, we used to play with the Hindu children. They used to come to our house. We used to go to theirs. There was peace, and then it got shattered. And what happened? It was just all of that was taken from us. And that's something that we can't forget. Whatever the political debates, the human element of the partition is something that we were foolish to forget. I think the other thing that I certainly remember is that I grew up in Alton, which is a town in Hampshire. Every year in Alton, there would be a kind of, is it November the 11th or... the Armistice Day. It was a big thing. It was a big thing. There's a central monument in Alton. I would go to it as well, either through school or actually it would be through, I think, Cubs or Scouts or whatever. You know what I mean? But I was there every year. There's a ceremonial aspect to it, isn't it? They shall not be forgotten. We shall remember them. I mean, I used to partake in it. I never really connected the fact that, I kind of knew that this was not for me, although I've subsequently realized that that's not quite true either, because my grandmother's father actually fought in Burma, right, for the British. I didn't know this. I've just found this out. But apart from this, I didn't realize that every people have a history like this. Every people have certain central defining moments, But my defining moment, that couldn't really be talked about. It's very personal to me.
So I'm still trying to get to it. I mean, look, we've talked about a lot of things. In a sense, you've been talking about. I find it very interesting about your grandmother that she highlights once again. It happens again and again in these situations how politics actually appropriates people's experiences. It says the politics says I have the master narrative. It is my narrative that will be heard, and personal experience it becomes marginalised. That they are just fodder or food for the master narrative. But of course, people don't live master narratives; they live personal narratives.
Absolutely.
And that's what's going on. But throughout this all, I can actually, unless I'm mistaken, you are still deeply affected by it. What is that defining moment of it for you? What do you mean by the defining moment?
I think Pakistan as a country was born of bloodshed and violence, of trauma, of sacrifice, of migration, of movement, Is that something, so we, as a family, we've obviously migrated twice. We migrated from India to Pakistan, then we migrated from Pakistan to, well, all over the world, but essentially primarily the UK. That's where the family is based now. Is that something that we should just forget now? It's an ongoing question for me, right? Is that something that was just part of our history, it just happened and doesn't mean anything? It's just the natural culmination of movements of people and politics that we don't really understand? Or does it somehow shape us and mean something much deeper to us, right? And different people from the diaspora on both sides have very different answers if you really ask them about these questions. There's many, many people who don't want anything to do with it, who don't want to remember. There's many people for whom it is a central part of their lives, but they don't want to discuss it. Similar to, similar to the Second World War for many people in this country. Yeah.
Yeah, you're a psychiatrist, and you've mentioned some of these things during this discussion. You mentioned one of the family figures who just turns away from it, and basically, for want of a better word, suddenly cares less or rejects the children because they're associated with that painful part of life. And you've got narratives about where we've come from and the violence and disruption of that, which some people don't want to engage with. It's too painful, or it's too shameful, because violence is an act of shaming in so many ways. Or they want to be something other than that. And I can think of relations I've got who there was no turning back once they've left. They wanted to reinvent themselves outside of those frames. What's that about? As a psychiatrist, how was that about?
I suppose that the question is that how do you how do you process trauma? Not just about the immediacy of the violence of the events, but the sense of loss, of longing, of what it says about you. And I found this fascinating that over the 20th century, as a psychiatrist, we've conceptualized PTSD in many different ways. So, it used to be called shell shock. And the descriptions of shell shock have some similarities with, but are not the same as how we would define, or how I would describe post-traumatic stress disorder today, But there's also hidden away, actually, in the ICD and the DSM, a diagnosis, I can't remember the full name of it. I always have to, but it's a enduring change in personality after trauma, So there's a recognition that trauma can sometimes, it's not just a pattern of predictable or mental phenomena which it leaves as an imprint on the brain, but somehow it can profoundly change us. There's other concepts which particularly are very well established in the Jewish community about intergenerational trauma. Now, my grandmother had a form of trauma. she wasn't a direct witness to what happened. She was deeply affected. When we went back to Senor, I found this fascinating. We went back to Senor, right? So we go back to her town. It takes a long time to get there. It's off the beaten path, right? You know? Senor has its own language. It's different from the Punjabi that is generally spoken in the rest of the Punjab. There's some similarities. So there's people speaking in these kind of competing dialects, right? And then so all of a sudden it's realized who she is. And some of the people who are there are still there. And they know who she is, and she sort of knows who they are. I think that her old house has been has been rebuilt, but I think the kind of tractor yard or where the stables, that's still there. We go sit in there. And then she turns around to me and she says, I can't understand them. I was shocked. Literally, I was shocked. You know, so my grandmother spoke perfect Urdu, very nice, you know, mellifluous. It was a pleasure to listen to her. I always used to think that I need to record her story, but I never could. There was something that stopped me from doing. I don't know what it was, right? But I was shocked. This is a lady who, until she was 17, this is where she lived. I thought you couldn't forget language. She had forgotten her birth language. You know?
It was. I presume it was a dialect of Urdu. So because she was still
Yeah, it was.
speaking Urdu to you.
Yeah, she was speaking Urdu, but she had forgotten that it was a dialect, I suppose, of Punjabi, which is in itself, one could argue, a dialect of Urdu, or you could argue it's the other way around. But I could have never imagined that you can just forget your birth language like that. You know, and I think that tells you about how, how far she had been from the trauma, but how, at the same sense, it was ever present and something that she could never forget.
I mean, it gives us a picture of trauma, because often a picture we carry in our imagination of trauma is the blunt instrument. It's the break on the arm.
Yeah.
And then heals, and there's just a line in the arm. We could actually X-ray that arm, and we'll see where the fracture was. It's healed slightly differently. But of course, it's more rhizomic. It's actually more like a plant growing, and it just grows in a very different way. Once it reminds me of those trees that absorb the fence. The barbed wire fence is grown into the tree.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it doesn't just affect one generation; it affects the next generation, because everyone's influencing everyone else. And they're behaving in certain ways, and they're discussing things in certain ways. Hang on, these are just cut out. And so what you're really talking about is intergenerational, is that whatever we're living, and whether we come from backgrounds of being migrants from violence or not, we're living with the traumas of the past, going back generations. But what you're really highlighting is any trauma going on now isn't going to finish when the traumatic event stops. It will continue for generations after generations. It will distort, and it will alter people, and they will struggle as a result, and they will affect others in a totally unpredictable ways. And when we look at violence today, and we go, we've got to put in a deal to stop this. How long does it take to recover from all that? Is recovery even possible? How do you deal with the traumas that have been handed down through generations? How do you deal with those ghosts? How do you deal with these stories? Because they shape a kid from Hampshire. It's not Surrey, it's Hampshire, isn't it? Where you're from?
Yeah, Hampshire.
They shape a kid from Hampshire. I mean, look at me. Part of my family escaped in a hay cart around the 1900s, late 1800s. Sorry, late 1800s, I think. They escape the violence that's going on, and they find family in Wales. but I could look at stuff going on, and then we have the the Second World War and the trauma of that, and the stories my parents are hearing as children and as teenagers, and how do you deal with that? And I remember there was this psychiatrist who was friends with my parents. I think he was their best man, and he was actually one of the pioneers in transgender. He was one of the early pioneers, a guy called Michael Tarsh. Must be long gone by now. And he came to the house once. He was a character, one of these big characters. And I was a teenager. And he suddenly turned into something else during conversation. I was probably discussing politics. I was a teenager. And he suddenly just went into this other space. He said, "We must survive! We must survive!" I was like, wow. I mean, I just left the room. It was like, so he'd picked up something which wasn't really his own survival. And he was an educated man, a psychiatrist, a very well-respected psychiatrist, on the television now and again, talking about his thing.
So what was he talking about when he was saying we must survive? Was he talking about?
I must have been questioning the state of Israel, or questioning this idea that of ethno-nationalism. I've always questioned that from quite a young age.
Oh no!
The fact that you go from formed states. As you know, I'm not a big fan of forming nation states in the first place. Sure. But I was probably about 14 and lippy, and but the reaction wasn't the reaction of an adult with an annoying teenager. The reaction was a traumatic response.
But so Jonathan, one of the things that I'm thinking more and more now, though, about this whole story is I grew up knowing this story, and I never connected it, but I also, of course, knew in great depth about the Holocaust because that's what we're taught in this country. I knew, of course, about the history of the Second World War, the First World War, knew somewhat about slavery, the great injustices that have happened, knew about the civil rights struggle, South Africa. This was a cultural milieu in which you go. And these all seemed so far in the past. And they seemed so remote. And there was this, perhaps this was just the hubris of youth. But, it was as if mankind had turned some kind of corner. And there was going to be civilized world now. There was, these things had happened, terrible things had happened, including this story. But this is not what we were moving towards as humankind. Now, of course, the other side of the 20th century, we seem to be slipping right back into that, And these stories are going to repeat. I can tell you, in some form or another. Maybe not from my family, maybe not for my children, but for somebody else's family and for somebody else's children. They will have, in 100 years' time, almost exactly the same stories, perhaps with different weapons, perhaps with different ideologies or religious affiliations or colors of skin. But the same story will be told, and it'll be told again and again and again. And the horrific violence that we seem to embrace as humankind, which terrifies me, absolutely terrifies me. I don't think we're that far away from it at the moment.
I totally agree with what you're saying. The only thing I would possibly disagree with is that we ever moved away from it. Modernism was a story that we were moving away from it. Never Again was a story that we were moving away from it. But actually, around the world, we didn't. It's been quite messy out there the last 50 years or so. Awful things have happened. They've happened on local levels. They've happened on national levels. We still haven't got to this idea of really tackling violence. The problem is we still celebrate the right to defend ourselves, and therefore we celebrate the right to attack others through in our own defence. And on we go, and on we go. Violence begets violence, begets violence. And the effects are huge. And what troubles me is how we teach that stuff and where we teach that stuff. And of course, if I live in a place where we have to salute the flag every day and where we celebrate this nation, which is at the heart of half the violence, if I celebrate my ethnicity as something that needs violence to exist.
Okay. Well, Jonathan, okay, I mean, we could do another series on the empire, the British Empire, because actually I do think that we have to take a balanced view on empire. But I do want to ask you one thing. Just this is one last thing, right? I'm Pakistani, of Pakistani stock heritage, right? It's the second largest minority in this country after Indians, right? I think everybody knows this. And then there's also a very sizable Bengali community in this country, yeah? There have been historical links between this country, the United Kingdom, and that part of the world for centuries. Why was I never... You know, when I grew up, I was just a complete anomaly. Why was none of this ever discussed at school? It's taken me years to work out that what happened there was a central part of who we are here. None of this, you know, I learned about the Tudors. I learned about the Henry VIII and his wives. I learned about Stephen and Matilda. You know, I mean, all of these things have their place. The spinning jenny, you know. But this story is a very important story in the history of modern Britain, and is a British story. It is a British story, you know. I wasn't ever taught it.
Okay, there's a problem in a sense. There's a lot of history, and there's only so much time. Second thing is, whatever history you teach is you're actually teaching politics. You're teaching a political viewpoint as soon as you teach politics. So you also have this idea that some people are very chronological and feel you should learn everything from the cavemen to the modern day. Other people feel you should dot around. Other people feel the kings and queens is very important because it's their view of history. Other people say, no, you should look at the effects of the British Empire. It's created what we are. And these are all political debates with quite predictable political parties attached to each one. So, you know, education ultimately is a political decision of what is learnt. Once you have a national curriculum, if you didn't have the national curriculum,
okay,
and the teacher could teach what they like, but then you've got an exam issue. But you could probably get around that. And the thing is, which I find interesting, is actually with technology now, you could come off the curriculum very easily and explore things reasonably well because it's far more accessible. What do we do is what you're really saying. What do we do with the acts of violence that have created where we are now? How do we engage with those acts of oppression, those acts of violence, to understand our happy lives now? Who are we in terms of those? And one of the vehicles for doing it is quite interesting. I mean, you can displace it. So you could look at a history of sound, or you could look at the sound of violence. It's a conversation I had with an anthropologist of sound, Holger Schultz, and it was like the sounds of war elsewhere allow us the peace we have here, because the British have always been outside their land. So it's those sounds. What did it all sound like there? And how does that therefore create the sound here? Because it does. Because sound is a wave. Ultimately, those reverberations continue. How do those reverberations hit us here? What did it sound like in that field that day? And how does that help us understand the sound we have when I switch off the light tonight and go to sleep? Because it's part of the same story. And it's not just your story. It's my story too, and it's everyone's story. We're all connected by the same reverberations.
Sure. Jonathan, I can't believe we've been friends for such a long time. I can't believe I've never told you this.
But it's a personal story.
It is, yeah. But Yeah. Well, thank you very much for listening, Jonathan.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, I see you a little bit differently.